Welcome back. This is Isaac Lee, and you're watching ACT Reading Prep. Now, so far, we've been looking into we even started with the last two lessons back. We have started with the natural sciences passages, and I'm hoping that you've sort of have a good idea of what the natural sciences passages will deal with. And as much as possible, you have that background, and as much as possible, you have that understanding, the quick understanding of the entire passage, and as well as the question types, right? We have two more to go with the natural sciences, and we'll continue with that this lesson and then a lesson after this. And what we're going to do also is that we're going to take a look at, if you notice by now, what we've been doing is we've been taking out 4 of the real tests or real ACT test mock tests, and we've looked into comprehensively into these different 4 tests, and we have one more test left for each one of these passages, or each one of these types of passages. And of course, what we want to do is we want to go over them at the very last, so that you kind of will get the whole point, all right? Especially in terms of, or in the view of test strategies, all right? That's what we're going to do. Of course, I'll explain that a little bit further when we get to that, but today let's try to wrap up the natural science passages, all right? Let's go into today's lesson or today's passage book, so please open them up and let's get started. All right. Passage 4, Natural Sciences. So we'll start with the description of the passage. It says this passage is adapted from the article, The Mars Model by Bridget Mintz-Testa, which appears in Discover magazine in 1995. Now notice how, if you remember the last time, if you remember the lectures that came before this, they weren't exactly what we call a how do you put it? They weren't exactly what we call a mainstream science, or at least it was a mainstream science, but it wasn't dealing with the mainstream scientific theories and science-related topics. They were most likely the previous forms of mainstream science, or the minor stream or minor science principles that many people consider it to be true, but still it has open, or it's open to the questions, all right? It's open to the scrutiny or criticism. So if you notice here, this one of course will deal with the Mars model. Now the mainstream science, well, it's not even true. I've been keeping up with Mars. I've been keeping up with the different Mars missions, and I've looked into it, and we haven't really found an exact evidence where it says that there was once water in Mars, or there might be a living creature or some kind of an alien life form in Mars. I mean, there's nothing really been confirmed, all right? I mean, we don't know yet what Mars actually, what kind of planet Mars actually is. And so therefore, you can't really call the study of Mars a mainstream science, but rather it's like a sub science, right? It's a sub principle of the science, right? I mean, so most of the natural science passages will deal with intriguing, exciting, yet not to mainstream science, all right? So always keep that in your mind, because you will see this here and the next passage that's to come later in the lesson as well, all right? So let's take a look at that. So it says Mars model, and so the first thing we want to do is read the first sentence and the last sentence, and then the first sentences of each and every one of those paragraphs that will follow. All right, so let's take a look at that. It says the first close-up images of Mars, captured in 1972 by probe Mariner 9, of course, were a planetary scientist's dream. They revealed networks of valleys that looked uncannily like drainage basins and stream beds back here on Earth, and thus implied that there had once been water freely flowing over the surface of Mars. Now, that was back in 1972 when a probe, which is unmanned probe, of course, this is a small probe we're talking about, Mariner 9, landed on Mars, and it started taking pictures, it didn't land on Mars. It was actually orbiting Mars, and it took pictures of what it looked like at the time, like stream beds or water basins, all right? At one time, there must have been water there. Now, it is a possibility, but it hasn't been proven yet. Of course, the probes have now landed on Mars, and they're taking pictures, and they're sending it back to Earth. And we really I mean, we haven't landed on that part of Mars where we saw the water basins and the stream beds yet. But you know, it hasn't been proven yet. It might be true, but it hasn't been proven yet. I mean, there were sources. If you remember, I mean, you can Google it right now. If you can Google Mars, and you can probably say extraordinary landscapes of Mars, and you'll probably find that the scientists thought from the pictures of Mariner 9 that there were underground tunnels in Mars. And strangely enough, it does actually look like an underground tunnels that would span the vast amount of land. All right, it's crisscrossing, and I mean, you know, it looks like an ancient city with like tunneling systems under it. I mean, you know, you can't really tell what it is. So I'm pretty sure when they said something of the you know, like drainage basins or the stream beds, they thought it was, but we haven't really proven it yet, right? So keep that in mind. Let's go to the next last sentence of the first paragraph. We'll start from somewhere. Well, we'll have to start from somewhere up there, but we'll start just right here. Okay, the last sentence, that actual last sentence, says, with warmth, water, and air, they speculated Mars might once have been a garden world, a paradise among planets. So again, this is not really a mainstream science, but we're just saying that if there were warmth, right? Because right now Mars, if you remember, it's Venus, Earth, and Mars, and so Mars is quite far from the sun, and therefore they're not getting as much sunlight as they should, or at least they are quite far, you know, out of the habitable zone of the universe. I mean, Earth is luckily on that habitable zone, you know, just 3 rocks from the sun, and so was it 3 rocks from the sun? So it's like the 3rd rock in our universe, I mean the solar system, and so therefore, you know, we are able to sustain life. But Mars is quite far away, and so with that warmth that Mars will require, and water, which there is no water right now in Mars, and the air, of course, the atmosphere in Mars is very thin. There is no air in Mars, on Martian atmosphere. Rather, I think it's more of a, how do you put it? I think there's more of carbon dioxide, so it has a high level of it's a low level of carbon dioxide. It would have a high level of nitrogen, just like on Earth, but they don't have oxygen, or the Mars doesn't have oxygen in its atmosphere. So what we need to do, if we see that Mars is a fit place for our survival, what we need to do is we need to terraform Mars by planting plants, right? Planting enough plants so that these plants will take in the carbon dioxide. I think it's carbon dioxide mostly made up. Carbon dioxide in, and then it will let out the oxygen, and so therefore it will balance out the air so that we are able to breathe it, right? So anyways, that's the idea here. So with those, Mars might have once been the garden paradise. You know, like it might have been the paradise for, you know, like plants and animals or whatnots. That's what they're saying. All right. But again, this is not a mainstream science, but this is a sub-science. So it's like something that hasn't been proven, but many think that it might be true, right? That sort of a topic here. All right. Let's go to the second paragraph. It says, but as they also discovered, the garden didn't last long. So again, I don't know who they are, but they have discovered that the garden that we're talking about here, the garden paradise, did not last long. So I don't know how long, or if they were, or there were any one of these gardens, but that's what they're saying in the second paragraph. Excuse me. The third paragraph. Researchers have suggested many scenarios for the Martian apocalypse. So now we go into the apocalypse, as in the end of the world for Mars, or Martians, or Mars people. Now, of course, this is of course under speculation, or it's under a same sort of a viewpoint that there once was Martian a garden like paradise in Mars, and that it came to an end, or abrupt end, right? But we don't know what that is. So here in the third paragraph, we're talking about the Martian apocalypse, right? All right, so whatever the apocalypse there might have been, that's what we're talking about. And then the fourth paragraph, it says, the basic idea, Milosh says, is that an impact doesn't just open a crater. We'll read the entire thing because this is what Milosh, we don't know who this person is, but whatever he's saying, right? So it's in quotations, so that's what we want to read. It says, with high velocities, the projectile vaporizes and expands into the atmosphere. All right, so that's the part that we want to read. So, this is like, how do you call it? This might be what we say a classic apocalyptic story. Usually what happens is that there's a asteroid or there's a meteorite that hits the planet, and it pulverizes and it devastates the entire planet, and hence the creature is dead and everything just becomes desolate, right? I mean, that's what the whole end of the world story is like. Because if you remember in the Earth history, dinosaurs were thought to be extinct because of the meteorite hit, right? I mean, so same thing here. So it must have happened. But then the basic idea here is that an impact doesn't just open a crater. So it's not just crater making, but what happens is that high velocities of these meteorites, right, or the asteroids, the projectile vaporizes, meaning pulverized into it. It just hits, let's say, for example, Mars. It hits the surface of Mars and it vaporizes instantly. And then what happens is that it expands into the atmosphere, expanding into the atmosphere and having some kind of effect on the atmosphere, right? That's what we're talking about in the 4th paragraph. And then the 5th paragraph says, to see if this process could account for Mars' missing atmosphere, Vickery and Meloche, again the same person, I guess these are the prominent figures in the theory of Mars being a paradise garden or garden paradise, essentially ran a film of the red planet in reverse, starting with today's WIMP-C atmosphere and adding back the air that might have been removed by impacts over the aeons, right? So anyways, what we're saying is that these two people, Vickery and Meloche, to try to figure out whether there has been atmosphere or not, they were running the film backwards, just meaning that they were trying to count their steps back, or count the steps of, or count the time back to where supposedly Mars have been formed, and see whether this atmosphere, or when this atmosphere might have disappeared, right? I mean, this is tracing backwards or working backwards, but it's not really exact science, right? We don't know that yet. So anyways, that's the idea on this paragraph, and they'll probably explain how they did this, right? All right, and the next paragraph says, however, now that an attractive explanation finally exists for how the young paradise of Mars was destroyed, some researchers are questioning whether the paradise ever existed in the first place. You see that? You see that? How there are some people, or the proponents that say, yes, Mars had been once a flourishing planet with plants and like diverse plants and animals or whatnot. But what we're saying here now is that yes, there are some scientists who are saying that it never have been a paradise, or it never have been some kind of a paradise garden for all plants and animals, right? That's what we're saying. So here, probably a rebuttal to whatever the scientists Vickery and Meloche has been stating, right? And then the last paragraph says, Vickery, however, is sticking by her original assumption. So Vickery, it's her, I guess, scientist her, she's sticking by the assumption, and let's read that quoted or quotation. There exists on Mars valley networks that look like terrestrial river valley networks and don't look like any other kind of feature found anywhere else in the solar system. And she points out, the first obvious interpretation is that these networks were formed more or less the same way as similar terrestrial networks, right? So she's still positing, yes, there are networks of terrestrial river valleys, right? And so therefore she's saying that it couldn't have been formed by anything else than the water erosion she's probably talking about, right? It's the same thing that you find it on Earth as well. And so what she's saying is that she's sticking by her opinion. Now, like I said, it's not a majority, or it's not a mainstream science when you say there once have been some kind of a garden in Mars, or some kind of life forms on Mars, because right now we can't really find any evidence as to the existence of any kinds of living form have once lived on Mars. We haven't found it yet. We were trying to find bacterial forms within the like soil samples or whatever the samples we're trying to look into. I don't think we have found them yet, right? So I guess in few years, maybe in a few decades, there will be a manned mission to Mars, and when we do actually have manned mission to Mars, possibilities are that we might find something, right? Or we might not find anything, right? But then again, there are other proponents, right? I'm sorry, not proponents, but there are other parties of scientists who are actually saying that we didn't even go to the moon, right? And I want to ask the same question. I mean, have we been to the moon? Were we able to pass that radiation belt that forms just outside our ionosphere of the Earth atmosphere? I mean, that's something that we want to ask as well. So I mean, nothing's proven yet. We need to know what has been happening, or at least what we can tell is that here, especially the natural science passages that we'll deal with in ACT are intriguing, exciting, very interesting topics, yet they're not really proven facts. All right, so remember that, please. All right, so far we've understood that these passages will deal with the actual Mars model, and as in what kind of a planet was Mars, and one say that it was a pretty much a life-bearing green planet, as opposed to others saying that it never had been. It's been like that. It's been the red planet from the beginning and for many eons, right? Okay, so that's what we're talking about. All right, let's move on to the first question. It says the author's purpose in writing the passage is most likely to do what, right? So think about it. Why would the author write this paragraph or write this passage? Now remember, the author is not Vickrey and Melosh. She's simply stating that Vickrey and Melosh were actually stating these type of theories, and there were others who were opposed to this idea. So why would the author of Discovery magazine would write this, right? So let's take some of the points out here. A, it says point out irreconcilable differences between the contending theories concerning the early history of Mars. Or is it B, examine why the early history of Mars is important in understanding other aspects of planetary science? Or is it to illustrate the differences in atmospheric pressure between Mars and Earth? Or is it to report on recent theories and controversies in research concerning the early history of Mars? Now remember, like I said, it was not a mainstream science, and so therefore, I don't think we're talking about this as in pointing out the irreconcilable differences between contending theories concerning the early history of Mars. I mean, we can't say the contending theories, meaning there are lots of different theories and they're contending each other, right? So meaning they're fighting to be the actual theory, right? Doesn't say irreconcilable differences. I don't think there's irreconcilable differences at all, but rather we're talking about report on recent theories by Vickrey and Melosh, and the controversies in the research concerning the early history of Mars, right? So the answer is definitely, right? You see how keeping in mind that this passage actually, the ACT natural science passages, are somehow not dealing with the mainstream science. That kind of gives you the idea of saying that yes, there might be controversies, or there has to be some kind of a controversy, right, as to what the theory says, the recent theory says. All right, so the answer will have to be D for this question. You get the idea, right? Let's move on to the second one. 32. The last paragraph supports the general hypothesis provided earlier in the passage that what, right? So we have read that last paragraph. Remember that last paragraph. The last paragraph says, Vickrey, however, is sticking by her original assumption that these terrestrial river valleys couldn't have been formed without the presence of water, right? So if that's the idea, what general hypothesis provided earlier in the passage is providing support for this, right? Is it a series of comets and asteroids repeatedly struck Mars? Or is it Mars formed about 4.6 billion years ago? Or is it Mars once had warmth, water, and air? Or is it large expanses of ice once covered Mars? So what can we say? Now, in order for you to say that the last paragraph, or I'll just write it for you here, the last paragraph says it has the terrestrial, right? Terrestrial river network system, river valley network systems, right? In order for it to have a terrestrial river valley system, right? What general hypothesis given by the earlier record or earlier content in the passage provides the support for that? Now, the earlier passage, let's go back to that earlier hypothesis of the paragraph, right? I think we're talking about right here, all right? So right here, this first paragraph. It says something about revealing the networks of the valleys that looked uncannily like the drainage basins or the stream beds, right? Imply that there once had been water freely flowing over the surface of Mars. That's what we're talking about. But if you read the last part of it, it says with warmth, water, and air, they speculated that Mars might once, they speculated, hypothesis is speculation, right? Hypothesis is speculation before you actually prove something, yes? And it says Mars might once have been a garden world, a paradise among planets, with warmth, water, and air, with freely flowing water over the surface of Mars that created some kind of a drainage basins and stream beds, right? So therefore, the hypothesis here we're talking about has to be what? That worms or Mars once had warmth, water, and air. The answer, of course, is H, right? You get the idea, right? The previous notion or previous hypothesis that says that Mars was once, or what Mars was once warm, and it had water and it had air. That supports the last paragraph that says that there are terrestrial river valleys or networks of these river valleys that must have been created with the freely flowing water, right? So the answer will have to be H. You get the idea, yes? All right, let's move on to the next, 33. Which of the following findings, if true, would best support the idea that Mars was once a garden world, a paradise among planets? Now remember, if true, right? It says if true, yes? If true, then a garden world and paradise among planets could be proven. So what would be one of these following findings, right? Let's take a look at this. I mean, this should be very simple. Images of Mars reveal networks of drainage basins and stream beds. By possibility, right? We'll just circle that for now. When the sun was young, it was 25 to 30% dimmer than it is today. Dimmer. Maybe not, right? Because when we say dimmer, 25 to 30% dimmer, what does that mean? Right now, it's been shining, or it's shining at 100%, right? When you say dimmer, brighter, brightness actually means that it's going to be warmer, all right? Remember that when you say bright, it means warmer. But if it dropped down to 70, or if it dropped down to 70 to 75%, meaning that, because if this is sun, right, we have Venus, no, we have Mercury, I'm sorry, Mercury, Venus, and we have Earth, and we have Mars, right? It's so far away from the sun. If there's 70-75% less sunlight, then this will not be a habitable zone, and we are not going to be a habitable zone because of the drops in the intensity of the heat, right? So therefore, this definitely not it. A succession of asteroids and comets struck Mars about every 10,000 years, or is it the large expanses of ice in Mars were thawed by a heat source deep within the planet? Obviously, the only answer will have to be A, right? Obviously, because that's the only thing that we actually have read from the passage that does make sense to the hypothesis that it was a garden and paradise among the planets, right? Because yes, images of Mars reveal networks of drainage basins and stream beds. Now, remember, it says if true, because like I said in the very beginning, we have found something that looks like the networks of drainage basins and stream beds. Not necessarily that they are actual, like drainage basins and stream beds, because like I said, they thought that there were underground systems for, certain parts of Mars, and it looks as if though it spans all throughout the cities, right? So therefore, if true, this will prove that it was a garden. But so far, we haven't really proven that these were, like the stream beds or where once the water flowed. We haven't really found the evidence for that, all right? So the answer will have to be A. 34. It is reasonable to conclude from the passage that the amount of solar heat a planet retains is most directly related to its distance from the sun and to what, right? So one of the reasons, it says, one of the reasons the amount of solar heat a planet retains is most directly related to, first of all, the distance from the sun, right? Remember, I told you, if this is the sun, you have the Mercury, Venus, and Earth, right? And Mars. And this right here is what we call the habitable zone, okay? Habitable zone, meaning this is where we'll have a perfectly good amount of sunlight and the heat, right? So therefore, that's one thing. And the other the other thing would be what? That's what we're talking about, right? The other thing. Now, keep your, try to turn your scientific brain around. And it says the amount of liquid water it has. The amount of water liquid it has got nothing really to do with the solar heat, right? Remember that. Solar heat, water does not trap the heat itself. Remember, actually, water reflects the heat, or water reflects the light. So, because if this is Earth, right? If say like this is the Earth, right? So, anyways, if this is Earth, remember, like 50% of water, or 50% of Earth is covered with water, or more than 50%, I think. I'd have to say it's like 60-some% of Earth is covered with water, right? And what happens is that when the heat comes in, when the sunlight comes in, it gets reflected back into the space. Remember that. That's what happens. And so therefore, liquid water, not really. Its distance from other planets got nothing to do with the solar heat. Thickness of its atmosphere, yes, that has got something to do with this. The volume and the mass of its underground ice, not really. Why is that? Remember, Earth has a thick, very thick atmosphere consisting of nitrogens, right? Nitrogen, we have oxygen, we have carbon dioxide, and so on and on, argon, and so on and on and on. Now remember, the carbon dioxide content, that's what we're very concerned with today, right? Carbon dioxide levels build up in the air, right? And the atmosphere becomes thicker and thicker by the minute. What happens is that when the sunlight comes in and gets reflected off, what CO2 does is that it will block off the radiating sunlight, or the reflected sunlight, to go outside, but it simply gets trapped inside, right? Therefore, the temperatures go up, and we call this a global warming, right? That's the idea. So therefore, the actual thickness of the atmosphere has got a lot to do with the solar heat itself. Remember that. Now, what we're saying about Mars is that Mars does not have a thick atmosphere. It has a very thin atmosphere. So therefore, there is no like insulation of the heat that has been, that has come to, or that has come from the sun, right? There's no insulation, and so therefore there's no life form yet to be found, right? So the answer will have to be H. Simple as that, right? Let's go to 35. The main purpose of the third paragraph, remember we've already read this, lines 22 to 32, is to point out that there are several theories about what. So let's take a look at the third paragraph. I mean, whether you remember it or not, we have actually read that, right? The first, the second, and the third paragraph, right? And it says lines 22 to 32. We've read this part. It says, researchers have suggested many scenarios for the Martian apocalypse. Remember how Mars was destroyed completely? That's the idea. Now, of course, we want to read this, but let's just go back and see what we're dealing with, all right? I don't think we will have to go back anyways. So here we go. So third paragraph is to point out that there are several theories about what? About why Mars is now a thin atmosphere, how carbon dioxide turns into rock, or how the wind of Mars became charged with particle, or why the sun gradually took away the atmosphere of Mars. So which apocalypse are we talking about? The apocalypse we're talking about, if you think in conjunction with the question that came just before, right? It says several theories about what? Several theories about Mars went into an apocalyptic state, right? Now, of course, there are comets and stuff in the apocalyptic state as well, but if you remember that reading that we just did a little bit later, right? So what happens to Mars, or what happened to Mars, was that these asteroids or meteorites hit on the Mars, or hit the Mars, right? It didn't just create craters, but what it did is that it pulverized upon impact and expanded it into the atmosphere, making the atmosphere thinner, right? That was the idea. So if that's the idea of apocalypse, then your only answer will have to be A, right? Why Mars now has a thin atmosphere. The only reason Mars, not only reason, but one of the major reasons why Mars went into an apocalyptic state is that because the asteroid which impacted Mars, right, it gets pulverized and it expands into the atmosphere. Somehow, we haven't really given the exact process of how this happened, but expands into the atmosphere and the atmosphere becomes very thin. That was the idea, right? So therefore, that's the apocalyptic idea. That's the main purpose of the third paragraph, and that's what we're pointing out here, right? The simple answer would be A. Moving on to next. The central idea of hypothesis proposed by Vickery and Meloche is that So what's the central main idea or hypothesis proposed by Vickery and Meloche? You should already know that Vickery and Meloche are stating that because there are riverbeds, or because there are what it seems like a terrestrial river valley system, the networks of these, right? She's believing, or she or he, I don't know if Meloche is a guy or not, but they are believing that yes, there once was Mars was once a garden, right? It was a paradise garden or among the planets. That's what they're saying. So if that's the idea, then let's try to find it. A series of asteroid and comet impacts pushed away the atmosphere of Mars. The atmosphere of Mars trapped too much heat and burned away a layer of carbon dioxide? Or is it the water vapor once prevalent on Mars was blown away by a wind of charged particles? Or is it a carbon dioxide on Mars was absorbed into the atmosphere and changed to carbonate rocks? So which one of these are we talking about, right? So right now you wouldn't be able to tell, right? You wouldn't be able to tell this, but I mean, in conjunction with, I'm just going to show you the previous. It says thin atmosphere, right? And we realized that, if you remember that drawing, we realized that there were comets coming in, right? Or comets or asteroids. And what happens is that they get impacted, or upon the impact, they get pulverized and put into the atmosphere, making the atmosphere thin. That's the apocalyptic idea, or the apocalyptic theory. That's been given by Vickery and Meloche, right? That's the idea, because Vickery and Meloche firmly believes that there once was a paradise, or the garden paradise in Mars. And what happened is, because of these things that happened, because of this theory that they are giving, Mars had become apparently very desolate, or apparently very, inhabitable zone, right? So therefore, if that's the idea, the only thing that comes to your head right now should be a series of asteroids and comets impacts pushed away the atmosphere of Mars. That's the only idea that should be coming into your head right now, that should be registered, because that's the hypothesis. Remember, we haven't read the entire thing, but we should already know that we're talking about the apocalyptic ending of Mars, or Martian paradise, or Martian gardening paradise, right? And it came about by the comets and asteroids hitting on Mars, and upon impact becoming, or pulverized into the atmosphere, and making the atmosphere thinner, and therefore you don't have that Mars anymore, right? So that idea here, or the main idea, the central idea is that the series of asteroids and comets, or comet impacts, pushed away the atmosphere of Mars, right? Simple as that. 37. Based on the passage, which of the following statements, if true, if true, would most weaken the hypothesis made by Vickery and Meloche, right? If true, weaken. So what are we talking about? So if one of these is true, it's going to weaken the hypothesis, saying that there once was a garden paradise in Mars, and that it was destroyed because of the comets and asteroids. So let's take a look at that. So something that would oppose the idea, because it's going to weaken, right? The network of valleys on Mars was made up of drainage basins and streambeds. Now this would actually strengthen, right? B, asteroids collided with Mars at a much higher frequency than was previously thought. This would also strengthen. Most of the comets and asteroids that struck Mars were very small. Now this would weaken, because if it's very small, right, we can definitely say that, it wasn't big enough, the explosion wasn't big enough, the pulverization wasn't big enough, so the atmosphere wouldn't have, right? Or the atmosphere around Mars was once as thick as Earth's atmosphere. Now this would strengthen, right? So the only thing that would weaken the hypothesis, would be C, right? If it's small, then it wouldn't have had an impact. It wouldn't have had as much or as big of an impact as it would have had if the comets and asteroids were big enough, right? So remember that. 38. If it could be proved that the young sun was 25 to 30% dimmer than it is today, if it could be proven, lines 67 and 68, then according to the passage, it might also be shown that Mars was what? Okay? So if 25 to 30% dimmer, if the sun back then, right, I don't know when, but it was 25 to 30% dimmer, then Mars would have also been like what? Okay? So has always had an Earth-like atmosphere, or has never had an Earth-like atmosphere, once had liquid water, or has been routinely hit by large asteroids. The only thing that you can think of here, remember, I told you this already when I was drawing that picture, right? Remember, Earth is right before the Mars, and we are in what we call a habitable zone, right? If ever the sun was 25 to 30% dimmer than it is now, then the Earth would not even have been on the habitable zone, right? Remember, the light itself has to do with, or the light intensity will have to do with the heat. And so therefore, we're talking about it would never had an Earth-like atmosphere. And of course, Earth itself would not have had that atmosphere as well. All right, that's the idea. So remember that, please. All right, so your answer will have to be G. Moving on to 39. The word projectile in line 35 means, now of course the projectile here we're talking about, usually this will appear in physics, right? If, say, a projectile, let's say if this is a rocket ship, this is a projectile, right? This itself is what we call projectile. Or let's say a ball is thrown, that's what we call projectile, right? Or if, let's say, a football was thrown, that's what we call projectile, right? Okay, so remember that, that's a projectile. Now, if that's projectile, what does it refer to? Now, I think we're talking about the projectile when we say line 35. Let's go back, all right? Let's simply go back to line 35 and see what they mean by projectile. I think you will get a good idea here. The basic idea, Melosh says, is that an impact doesn't just open a crater. With the high velocities, the projectile. So the projectile here is what we're talking about, right? And this projectile is probably the comets and asteroids, right? So remember that. So if that's the idea, then, of course, the answer to this question would have to be a large mass of charged particles carried by the wind, or is it the large mass of carbonate rocks, or is it a plume of water vapor, or is it an asteroid or a comet? Most definitely it will have to be an asteroid or a comet, right? Simple as that. Remember, people, the very simple question, all you have to do is you just remember the general flow, or at least how the passages go about, right? And because we've read the important parts or the topic sentences of the paragraphs, we know what we're talking about. All right, so last one, 40. According to Vickery and Melosh, about how long did it take Mars to go from a planet with an Earth-like atmosphere to a planet with the atmosphere it has today, right? So this one is exactly what this is what we call a detailed question. Now, what you want to do here is that, yes, you could find some kind of a key points here and there, right? But more than not, or more likely than not, what I want you to do is I want you to find these numbers within the passages if you want to solve it faster, okay? You know, there are a lot of ways to do this. For example, what you can do is say Vickery and Melosh, and you can find their names, and if you remember, it's the certain paragraphs that has their name and their hypothesis in it. Or what you can do is find 10,000 years, find 600 to 700 million years, or 3.7 billion years, or 4.6 billion years, and try to see if it matches up with any one of these ideas from Earth to Mars, right? Okay, so let's go. 40. We'll find it, right? So we'll find all those numbers eventually, I'm pretty sure, all right? But we just want to try this, all right? So let's skim through. We'll skim through 4.6 billion years ago, it's right there. But that is probably this. So when planetary scientists proposed that when Mars formed, so Mars was formed 4.6 billion years ago, right? So it doesn't mean that it took 4.6 billion years for Mars to go from Earth-like planet to the Mars today, right? Okay, so that's probably not true. There's 3.7 billion years, but what does that mean? It says, but as we discovered the garden didn't last long, none of the stream beds were younger than 3.7 billion years. Something happened to Mars, something happened or has stripped nearly all of its atmosphere, killed its streams, and froze the garden forever. So I guess 3.7 billion years old, right? It says 3.7 billion years old of the stream beds. And so therefore it might be a possibility. 3.7 seems to be a good idea, right? Okay. Now let's find 10,000 and as well as 600 to 700 million years, all right? So skim through it. We have 3.7 billion again, and we have 10,000, and we have 60 to 70 million years. So let's try to read that part, all right? It says, using an impact rate that prevailed 3.7 billion years ago, one impact every 10,000 years, that's one impact every 10,000 years, Vickery and Melosh were able to start with the virtually dead planet and grow a thick atmosphere in only 600 to 700 million years. So 3.7 billion years seem okay, but 3.7 billion years ago is the actual using an impact rate that prevailed 3.7 billion years ago, all right? because these stream beds, right, they were at least 3.7 billion years old. I mean, they must have been formed with water, but they might have been formed with the impact as well. So if that impact happened every 10,000 years, you'll get 600 to 700 millions of years of the actual the atmosphere shrinking. So therefore, the answer here you will come down with should be 600 to 700 million years, right? Not 3.7 billion years, but 607 million, because 3.7 billion years looked good, right? But it doesn't really say that it was 3.7 billion years of, say, 3.7 billion years of a good atmosphere or a good thick atmosphere like Earth and into the Mars atmosphere right now. But it was 600 to 700 million years if you count back with every 10,000 years the asteroids or comets hitting and into the impact patterns of 3.7 billion years, right? So therefore you get 600 to 700 million years. So remember this. Remember, you see how this is so easy for you to answer, right? It's kind of like clockwork. I mean, you can find the answers right away. You don't even, I mean, remember, we didn't even have, so I'll just show you. Let me just show you how much we read, all right? So remember, we read pretty much a good portion of the first paragraph, because remember, introductory passages or introductory paragraphs are very important. The second paragraph, we read only the first and the last because we had to read the 3.7 billion years. Next one, we haven't read the entire thing. We just read this part, the first paragraph or the first sentence of the paragraph. Same thing with this. We only read the first paragraph of the sentence, right? Remember this. We haven't read the entire parts here. We only read this part, which is the first part. We haven't read this. We have read this because it involved the 3.7, 10,000, and 6 to 700 million years. And we only have read this. We haven't read that at all, right? Remember that. We haven't read that at all, but we were able to solve this. And we only read that part, and we had to read the entire part because of the quotations, right? So we only read like 50% of the passages, and we were able to solve the questions with no problem at all. You see how this works, right? So let me suggest those of you who have problem with time, especially in reading passages, especially those of you who work in order, like from the prose fiction to the social sciences and to humanities and to natural sciences. Some of you out there, I'm pretty sure, have a difficult time in keeping up with time, right? Difficulty with keeping up with time, right? Especially in the natural sciences, you wouldn't have the time, so you usually choose and pick your answers, right? You just guess your answers. Either be A, B, or C, or D, right? I mean, I understand. But as you have seen here, right, you don't really have to read the entire thing. Coupled with your basic knowledge behind these main ideas, behind the topic, and as well as your quick understanding of the topic sentences, you should be able to solve these questions with no problem whatsoever, all right? Trust me, that's what you need to do, all right? So let me show you this again in the next set of lessons, and I'm hoping that you practice a lot, and as well as read a lot of. I mean, if you can't read, watch a lot of stuff, right? I mean, what I really enjoyed watching as a young child, or at least like a teenager, was, I know it seems a little geeky, but it was Discovery Channel and like National Geographic channels and these documentary channels, and I've learned a lot through these channels, all right? These programs, I mean, the programs today seem a little bit crappy. It does. Discovery Channel had become more of an entertainment, like, for example, with that guy, with Bear Grylls and, people like that, right? I mean, I've recently seen an episode with Bear Grylls and Channing Tatum, right? And what they were doing was they were trying to survive in the wilderness, and they would eat weird stuff and so on. I mean, it became more of an entertainment than an actual survival guide, right? I mean, it's likely that you're going to or you're going to be wound up in let's say an Amazonian jungle all by yourself with no survival kit at all. I mean, it's likely going to happen, but Discovery Channel has become so much of an entertainment rather than information or informative channel. But either way, it still will give you a good idea of the different backgrounds and different things that happen, different things that you need to know in science-related topics, as well as humanities and social sciences as well. They have good programming, they have good documentaries about different people, different historical figures, and so on and on and on. All right. So I want you to make sure that you have a good understanding, background information, and good fast reading techniques. All right. And the question understanding ability. All right. All right. So that's it for today. We have one more natural sciences passages left, and I'll see you back then, or I'll see you then. Goodbye.